welcome to yet another session of InDialogue Foundation Certificate Course in Dialogue Studies 2023-2024. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Sucharita Sengupta with us. She will speak on climate dialogue, a gendered discourse. Dr. Sucharita Sengupta is Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. She graduated from Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi, and has completed her MA, M.Phil, and PhD from School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has previously worked with the Indian Express, Chandigarh, the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, University of Pennsylvania Institute for the Advanced Study of India, UPIASI, and Indraprastha College for Women, University of Delhi. Her areas of interest include climate politics, urban studies, and gender. Dr. Sengupta, we have up to 2 hours for the session, and you may leave as much time for questions and discussions as you like. And as usual, I'd like to remind all the participants that keeping the cameras on during the session is mandatory. Ma'am, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A very good afternoon, everyone, particularly Behzad, who's always been very kind to include me, in this program. I think last year I could not join for a variety of reasons, but I'm very, very happy to be back this year speaking to all of you. I will be talking about, in the context of dialogue, of course, looking at, where is gender placed in this global dialogue on climate change that we've been having, for a while now, right? So that's what I'm going to look at, and I've divided my lecture into 2 parts. One is where I express some thoughts and ideas about dialogue, mostly because I feel that those are the parts which are relevant to the second part of our discussion, which is looking at gender and climate change. And then I'll leave it to all of you to see, how to put it together. I have tried to link all these 3, of course, right? So I've looked at the ideas of some scholars, philosophers of dialogue itself, the idea of dialogue, and I selected those which particularly appeal to me in the context of, the topic that I am going to talk to you about. So first is Bruce Ackerman, who wrote this in 1989. Perhaps you might have encountered his ideas, perhaps you have not encountered his ideas, but I found them very, very pertinent. So how does Bruce Ackerman understand the concept of dialogue itself, right? He looks at dialogue as the first obligation of citizenship, right? We are talking about politics here, so the questions of citizenship, state, etc., the international community naturally arise. Now, before he goes into this discussion, he also talks about, a dialogue with the self, an individual's dialogue with the self. Now, he does not believe that that is unimportant, but in the wider context of community, in the wider context of society, and in the wider context of politics, he believes that, he brings in the question of the citizen and tries to connect the idea of why dialogue is important for citizens, and he frames it in the sense of a responsibility. And this is what he argues, that a responsible citizen cannot cut herself off from political dialogue. So it's not an option. He's not framing dialogue as an option. He's framing dialogue as more of a responsibility, and says that if you wish to be a responsible citizen of your state, then looking at dialogue is something that is imperative. Now, he also gives a caveat when he says this. He says that he's not looking at, an idea of dialogue which is happening in a perfect world where, all assumptions that we think about prior to dialogue have been made. We are very sure of what the outcome of the dialogue would be, so on and so forth. He says, no, that's not the kind of perfect world in which we are carrying out this dialogue. We are actually carrying out the dialogue, the world we live in. And the world we live in, Lord knows, is not utopian at all. It's not perfect at all. So we are conducting a dialogue in a very imperfect sort of a world. And that is something he asks us to remember, right? And this leads us to the other question, which is that on one hand you can theoretically come up with several ideas of what constitutes an ideal speech, and very very broadly, ideal speech would be where we are able to express ourselves, but also where the listener is able to comprehend us exactly in the way in which we have expressed ourselves. You've been all doing this course on dialogue, you've had classes, and I'm sure at some point of time you have probably understood that the message may not be received exactly as it is intended. Different individuals might receive the same message, interpret the same message differently, right? So that is something he says that we need to keep in mind, that we are not operating in an ideal world, and we must work on the assumption that what we say might be misheard, interpreted very differently from how we wanted to, what we wanted to get across. And so the world of practical politics, which is where we are all operating, especially if you're talking about the politics of climate change, climate negotiations, that's where we are. We are trying to solve an issue. That's what he means by practical politics. And that is why dialogue becomes very central to politics. He comes to this point because this skepticism has been raised that if it's not a perfect world, if all of us are going to misinterpret and misunderstand each other, what is the point of talking to each other at all? What is the point of having a dialogue at all? And so therefore, why should dialogue be central to politics? And this is his response, that one is that we reflect by ourselves and we try to arrive at some kind of a moral truth about the world we live in. He says that here within the liberal project, we are not talking about arriving at a moral truth. What we are trying to do is resolve problems in public life. The two are completely different, the two completely different directions. Now, does he say that, it is a bad idea to be moral? No, at no point does he suggest that it is a bad idea to be moral. He simply says that practicality demands something very different and morality demands something very different. So in your personal life, you could have conversations with yourself, your friends, and everyone could be out searching for what is morally correct, what is not morally correct. But what will happen in political life is that when you talk to others, you will meet people whose morality is not the same as yours. It's not congruent to your morality. So does that mean that if we do not agree morally with someone, we cannot or should not or do not work with them? Because if that's the stand we take, then how do we resolve problems in this world? And climate change is one such problem which requires a vast groups of people to talk to each other, and these are groups of people that don't agree with each other in terms of the subjective moral viewpoints at all, right? So they're very clear that we are looking at a kind of a pragmatic politics where despite differences, people find themselves inhabiting the same planet. And now what's happening on this planet is that we now have scarce resources. So how do we talk to each other about how these scarce resources need to be used? There's so many very, very difficult questions going on over here. And in order to sit together, we will have to put aside for a moment the idea that our moralities are exactly the same. This is only expected to be reasonable. He further expands upon this and says that X's refusal to talk to Y about pragmatic questions will disqualify them from the liberal project itself. Please do remember that all of these arguments are only being made within the context of a liberal democratic project. We are right now not even entering into other type of polities where liberal democracy may not exist or may exist to a much lower degree, so on and so forth. So if in order for you to claim that you are liberal or you are democratic, you have to participate talking to X whose moral universe may not match your own, and that's the point of conversation. And this is what he means by dialogic obligation, and this entire argument is what he refers to as the supreme pragmatic imperative. Now, the other question that he does address is that if not dialogue, then what? Are there any alternative options available? Let's suppose we want to solve a problem. One way is to do it via dialogue. Are there any other ways to do it? So, one of the ways that he comes up with is that of the marketplace, which is that within the global marketplace, you transact, you trade with each other, you buy, sell, you have something I need, I have something you need, we exchange it using currency, so on and so forth. And this could be one way to get our basic needs satisfied. And on the face of it, it seems that no dialogue, no conversation is, no thinking, nothing is involved in this kind of transaction. Now, is that true? Is that correct? That in order to be in the marketplace and transact, no dialogue, no dialogic interaction is required. His sense and my own sense is that that cannot be true. Even in order to trade, you need to agree on certain terms and conditions of trade. You need to agree to come together at a particular point and say, okay, this is how we are going to carry out this business. To arrive at that, also, you are going to need to have a dialogue. Now, if you look at, centuries of trade that have happened across empires, across communities, where different groups of people with different identities, different languages have traded with each other, but they've reached some agreement on some commonalities where then they have been able to take the transaction forward. So to suggest that the market is free of dialogue or should be free of dialogue or is a place where the messy business of talking to each other and working out a solution does not exist, even that is not the case. And to give you some very concrete examples of this, I would ask you to think about why so many economic forums are proliferating worldwide. I mean, you've had the World Economic Forum for a very long time. Well, what is it? It's a forum where leaders come together in order to figure out the nitty gritties. That is, they enter into a dialogue to arrive at certain decisions that are going to make trade better across the countries. If you also look at regional groupings or even non-regional, but security groupings or economic groupings that have been forming of late, right? Whether you're looking at the Quad, whether you're looking at older formations, all of them have a very strong component of capitalism, trade, transaction, the marketplace economy, etc. Right? So really, the reason that this particular example has been raised is to tell you that there is really no place in society which would be free of the imperatives of dialogue. You cannot move forward, you cannot do much, you cannot take any type of decision without dialogue. And so dialogue is not something which is namby-pamby, something which is fluffy, something which is impractical. That is not how we want to characterize dialogue, and that's what he is arguing. Now, of course, can there be any impediments to dialogue? Immediately, I can think of a very, very long list of impediments. But one of the impediments is this expectation that because we are talking about, putting our moral universes aside, so you come to the table with a certain amount of neutrality, right? Now, in real life, this neutrality is not really possible. That's because we are all embedded in society. None of us come from we're not really all that atomistic as we'd like to believe. And so we're all embedded in certain belief systems, certain norms, certain values, and which we carry with us consciously or unconsciously at all points of time. And so it's not really possible to be neutral. And so neutrality can actually, far from being something that is advantageous, can actually come in the way, because then you say, okay, unless and until all participants say that they are going to be completely neutral, we cannot carry forward this dialogue. Well, if that's the condition you lay out, then you will never have a dialogue, right? So these are, definitely some of the issues, and so flagging also the idea whether neutrality is entirely, desirable or not. So instead of neutrality, the aspect that we can look at which might facilitate dialogue is conversational restraint. What does this mean? When we hear the word restraint, that doesn't sound good. on one hand, we are talking about getting into conversation, but on the other hand, we are starting talking about restraint. Now, the author, which is Bruce Ackerman, very clearly says that here, when we talk about conversational restraints, we're not talking about restraints on the questions being asked. Because when you say conversational restraint, it could also taken to an extreme translated. So please, you dare not ask X question. You dare not question this particular aspect. Dare not, question that particular aspect, so on and so forth. No, it's not. The restraint is not on the questions that are being asked. The restraint is more on the kind of response that is given to the question being asked, where a certain modicum of civility is what is required. And that is the sort of conversational restraint that Bruce Ackerman is talking about. So these are some of the very broad points that he lays out in terms of the utility of dialogue and some models of dialogue. He says much more, but this is what I thought was pertinent for us, so I'm highlighted. From there, we move to a scholar of international relations, because that's my qualification, that's what I teach, that's what I understand best. An IR theorist, Andrew Linklater, who has not only engaged with the work of Bruce Ackerman, but he's also engaged with the work of Peter Burke and of Jürgen Habermas, to essentially bring, all of these ideas of the public space and conversation into the study of international relations itself, right? So from there, I pick a few points, and these are cherry picked, of course. If you want, maybe I can share the readings with you so you can read all of what they say, right? And he takes Norbert Elias's framework, and what does Elias say? He says that all societies are capable of having civilizing processes. And what does he mean by civilizing processes? These are ways in which societies try to resolve problems, right? And he further says, trying to solve the problems of how persons can satisfy basic needs without destroying, frustrating, demeaning, or in other ways harming each other time and again in their search for satisfaction. So how can we not follow a destructive, a violent path and still try to find solutions to the very complex everyday problems? And this is the framework within which dialogue takes place. And this is also the answer to this question, is that you do this via dialogue. Now, this is nothing new, in the sense that the idea of dialogue itself, we know, is nothing new. By now, you've done enough, I'm sure, about the history of dialogue, the understanding of dialogue in, variety of societies. In our own society, if you go back to what was, South Asia at one point of time, if you have to go 2,000 or 5,000 years back, dialogue is very, very important. Dialogue between a variety of stakeholders, even at a time when we didn't have the modern state, when we had an empire, even there, dialogue is still taking place, and we have some remnants, some historical proof of that, right? Congregations in the courts of kings, or just roadside chats, whatever the case might be, all of them constitute some form of dialogue. In the context of Europe, Peter Burke particularly refers to something called a courtesy book. So these were like guidebooks or manuals, right? And they came out in Britain and France in the 17th and 18th century. So they were like small booklets that would be distributed, and people could read, that when you want to talk to each other, how to do so courteously. Now, this might seem very odd in one sense, that, you're teaching people to talk to each other. Who needs a manual to talk to each other? But since all of you are very intelligent people, and I'm sure you understand that you will not always find people who are willing to talk to you in the way you want. You're not, or sometimes people are socially awkward, so they don't know how to put their point across, and perhaps a manual might actually help such people. And then we up the ante further, we escalate the standards further, and we say that we are teaching you to talk to each other in a bid to create a more civic public space. And the creation of that civic public space is a critical input into what you call a democratic society, right? So look at, the multiple sources from which this idea of the dialogue and a civilized dialogue is emerging. Not only is it a source, but this was seen as a goal as well. One way to look at all of this is that these were sources of dialogues. The other way is to look at all of this that dialogue was the goal, and all of these were processes that were being initiated to sort of train the public, educate the public into normalizing the idea of this kind of a civic dialogue and a civil dialogue, both a civic and a civil dialogue with one another. So rules for how to have conversation, listen for as long as you're heard, ways to speak, so on and so forth, all of these are given in the manuals. And of course the social value of emotional control is again emphasized. Now Bruce Ackerman also talks about conversational restraint, and if you go 2-3 centuries back in Europe, the manuals are also talking about emotional constraint. They're not telling you, then probably not detailing what that means. That's for later philosophers to understand, but they're highlighting the idea of some kind of constraint while talking to one another. So what are some of the basic approaches that we get? The idea of the public sphere, which was then expanded upon by Jürgen Habermas, formed something called a discourse theory. And there are a few assumptions of this discourse theory too. Firstly, that when you enter into a dialogue, you do not know what you are going to learn from whom. So this preconceived idea that you can only learn from certain type of people, that is something that has been taken aside or is being sought to be demolished, right? At the end of the day, look at our own lives. We meet a whole lot of people, not all of whom are at par with us, not all of whom belong to the kind of identity that we do, so on and so forth. And yet, when you choose to enter into a conversation with them, like it or not, you will go away having learned something. Even if you discover something that you do not like, even then you have learned something. So this is one point that Habermas emphasizes. The second point that is emphasized is that those who are entering into a dialogue with each other should try to reach agreements, not on the basis of power, but on the basis of what is a good argument. Again, you can understand and see that this is a very, very tall order. We live in a world where might is right, and might can be put behind bad arguments and push them ahead. In the case of climate change, for example, we have a whole lobby of individuals called climate deniers who believe that climate change itself is a conspiracy that has been created in order to shut down companies and so on and so forth, right? And when you put the might of a lot of big money behind these very specious and very wrong and fallacious arguments, you will find again that a bad argument might win. And so perhaps stating the obvious that please look for the better argument and stay away from imperatives of power. And a third point is to try and think from another's standpoint. Again, it will feel like stating the obvious, but thinking from another standpoint is a truly, truly difficult thing to do. And therefore, it requires a lot of perhaps deliberate intent as well as deliberate practice. Now, what else, according to Habermas, is important in this, public-spirited discussion that we are talking about, which would be central for politics and therefore political negotiations, including that of climate change, is something that is directly relevant to what we want to talk about, which is the question of recognition. We already know that participation without recognition in a democracy is useless. If you do not recognize certain communities, you will not allow those communities to participate and make decisions. So for the longest time, for example, people of color, right, that is non-white persons, were not allowed to take part in decision making because very often they were not even seen as human, they were seen as property. Similarly, for the longest time, women, for instance, were seen as property of whoever was the head of the household. And this was normalized. Today, you might find this very strange. How can women be property, right? But this was in a country like the United States of America, this was perfectly normal, which is why even white women had to fight. And of course, women who were slaves were indeed seen as property. So this is in the larger um, frame of time. This is a relatively recent development. So who do we often not give recognition to? We typically don't give recognition to groups of people who are denigrated, who are disrespected, and who are marginalized. Now, women and other genders definitely fit this bill. Irrespective of women's numerical strength in the world, the fact is that in terms of culture, in terms of patriarchy, women have always, been placed socially inferior to men. And recognition for women has also come very, very late. And without the recognition, participation of women in variety of political processes, of course, was not possible. We need to give people who have been marginalized previously the space to speak out. And that is one of the important reasons why dialogue is central to politics. So this is a line which I thought was wonderful. A permanent openness to dialogue is necessary to deal with new and unexpected denials of recognition which may arise as old social structures wither away. So they're talking about times of transition. They're saying that, you may say in the 20th century that, okay, now we've given recognition to men and women as equal, right? Women can vote, women can participate, they can go out and work, they can, choose who to marry, they can choose in terms of their reproductive rights, so on and so forth. Right now, we come to the 21st century, where the spectrum of gender itself is now expanded. Right now, you'll have to include not just men, women, but perhaps LGBTQIA communities, which have heretofore been completely marginalized in a variety of processes of talking, and this will continue. The more you discover that there are communities that are marginalized, the more you have to work hard in order to bring them into the process of dialogue, which means that the openness of dialogue is something that has to remain permanent and which has to move with time, right? All of this, what I've spoken about so far, please remember again, is happening in the context of liberal democratic societies. In non-liberal societies, these are not questions that are raised at all. But also do remember that it is marginalized groups in non-liberal societies that have raised these questions and made possible the transition towards more liberal societies. Again, I will talk to you both about, slavery, civil rights, women's rights, so on and so forth, right? Now, women as a group, of course, they face challenges to recognition. They're marginalized in a variety of ways. And so, therefore, they fit the bill for participation in dialogue. Now, they've been kept out of public life for the longest time, especially political life for millennia. And it was only as late as the 20th century that women finally started being included. I mean, come to think of it, the right to vote for women did not come earlier than 1920. So it's been just about 100 years. So, in the whole existence of civilization, women have been relegated to the private sphere for the longest time. Please look after the household, care for the elderly, care for the children. Don't step out of the house unless it is for tasks designated for you, for the particular roles assigned to you. All of that, and definitely do not think about coming into public life and voicing your opinion at all. So we live in a time, thankfully, where this is not the case. But we must remember that this change is only 100 years old. So contrast the rise of civilization to women's rights, the very, very small time frame. And keeping all these points in mind, my aim is to see the place and concerns of women in the ongoing dialogue on climate change. So the first question, of course, is why include women? Again, it would sound obvious, but believe me, when you go out into the real world, there are lots of people who you will encounter who sincerely believe, even now, that this is not something women should be doing, right? Being part of high politics, being part of international negotiations, really, just send whoever's working, and really, what is the need to have more women or women's representation over there? And I think part of what all of us as academicians and professors and thinkers do is take what is believed to be the obvious and break it down. And so this question, why include women, right? And my answer would be a very simple one, because we are people. Really, we don't really need any reason more than that. But let's move to some other type of arguments that have been given by other scholars and break this down further for more pragmatic purposes. Now, Margaret Scooch, she offered two types of arguments. The first argument, she's talking about gender mainstreaming. The other thing to remember is that now gender mainstreaming is a matter of policy. In in the United Nations, and which is, I'm talking about the United Nations particularly because it is under the aegis of the United Nations that the climate negotiations are going on. In the various associations and various work of the United Nations, now gender mainstreaming is being taken seriously. And of course, it's also being done outside of the United Nations, but we are within this context. So the first argument that Margaret Scooch gives is that gender mainstreaming will increase the efficiency of the negotiations. What does this mean? When you have recognition and then you make different types of people participate, that means women, it improves the impact that your negotiation process can have, because of course women will bring something to the table which we are assuming that men cannot bring those perspectives, or simply because women are intelligent and they may simply bring a whole new set of ideas. Not necessary that men cannot bring those set of ideas, but why leave out any human resource which can bring in a new set of ideas? So improving the efficiency of the climate negotiations is one argument that is being given for gender mainstreaming or greater inclusion of women and their participation. Second is that if gender considerations are not included, gender equity will be threatened. So even before we started talking about questions of climate change, there were other conventions, and those conventions had already started talking about questions of gender equity. Gender parity has been a goal under the United Nations now for a very long time. So when you don't include this in your climate change negotiations, you actually push back the cause of gender equity. And so overall, the quality of climate policy that will be made if women are not included will be unacceptably low. The discourse will be very, very poor. You'll have rooms full of men talking to each other, and the concerns of a large section of people would have completely been left out of that. Now, so far, if you look at the international forums on climate change, the debate on climate change has been very, very narrow. So the focus has been on the economic effects of climate change, on questions of efficiency of machinery, work, anything that reduces GHG gases, and of course on technological solutions to a lot of the problems that we are facing. And Scooch she argues that the solutions, the discussion around climate change cannot be so technocratic. It cannot be so narrow. It has to be humane. It has to look at human perceptions. It has to look at their values. It has to look at their behavioral choices. And if you want to do all of these things, you must include women, which also tells us that this technocratic viewpoint that you see somehow merely law and technology and policy will resolve a problem is also a very, not only a male point of view, but it's also a very patriarchal point of view. Already, I'm sure that if you have some insight into questions of gender, women are often seen as not understanding rationality and therefore not understanding science. And climate change is all about science. So this becomes a perfect excuse to leave women out of these discussions. And so in order to bring them back in, we need to focus on these other aspects that we are talking about. Taking into account voices from different social groups, obviously diversity that improves the measures that you have, and these diverse social groups includes women. And when you make a particular forum, in our case, the Climate Change Negotiations Forum, more inclusive, what that will do is that will automatically attract more women, individuals, women's groups to want to participate. They will bring their own skills, their talents, their viewpoints to the table. And we know by now that diversity is far, far better than lack of diversity when it comes to resolving social and political problems. Now, you'll be very surprised to know after I've said all this that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the major treaty on climate change, does not include a component of gender. Prior to this, you've had a variety of conventions. You've had Agenda 21, you've had Convention on Biodiversity, you've had Convention of Desertification. All of them, without fail, have looked at a gender positive response. They've included the role of women, they've included the impact on women, and so on and so forth. But the main climate change treaty, when it was formulated, does not have any mention of women. It is partly the nature of the problem itself. Air is polluted. How is this a gender issue? The first time, you ask this question, air is polluted. How do you even break this down into a gender issue? No, if all of us are going to die of asphyxiation, that PM 2.5 is not going to see whether you are male or female and attack you accordingly. But that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. When we break this down further, we realize the way in which this entire problem and this entire discourse can also be very, very gendered, right? And so it is a little alarming that the UNFCCC did not look at this aspect at the time of drafting. But thereafter, at the conference of the parties, where every year, all the parties to the UNFCCC meet up, over a period of time, they have included some discussions on gender. The problem is that these discussions have not been very, consistent. So you'll have, the first COP where you'll have perhaps a mention, and then 5 years later you'll have another discussion on gender. Then again, 2 years later you'll have a discussion on gender, and those would also be in the sidelines. They would not be part of the main discussions. They would be in a little hall in the back, a few women, 30 women attending, so on and so forth. So you can already see, purely in terms of the optics and representation, that perhaps all 30 women who are participating are saying something very important. But if you give it a tiny hall, at the back of the venue, no one's really going to take it seriously, right? So these were all issues that sort of came up in a very big way. And it was not until COP22 in Marrakesh, as late as 2016, that finally it was decided that climate change responses have to also be made gender responsive at every level, whether international or absolutely local. So the experiences of women who are involved in international negotiations on a variety of issues is the question of gender is typically left out unless the pressure is applied to include them. Why we need to have this discussion on gender and to include it as part of dialogue is because when, for example, the UN Security Council was formulated and questions of war were being looked at, question of war damages were being looked at, they were looked at in a completely gender undifferentiated way. War, in any case, is a very, very patriarchal exercise. And, the losses to women, the impacts of women are very, very different. And it was not until a large cohort of women pushed for what was now known as United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which looked at mainstreaming gender in all aspects of questions of security, that it happened. And this also took years. So the experience of a lot of the women who participate in these negotiations is that unless they speak out, to start with, gender is not included. So you look at the levels at which we are facing the problem. It's not enough that we exist on this earth, but if a chance arises, women would be left out of dialogues. And that's why this session on having women as part of dialogue, and particularly of a dangerous problem like climate change, which I'm sure all of you already know has already started affecting us. And to sum it all up, we are in 2024 now, and this is the state of the world where we are still having to push for participation in something that impacts our very lives. Now I will come to, more directly on the more local sort of, impacts on women, where what I will do is I will make visible what kind of impacts are there on women, but also what is their role, what is their agency in terms of climate change. And this is also a very complicated picture. In all honesty, even as a feminist, I cannot broadly only say that, climate change impacts women versus men, that there are complications over there. So everywhere else, I very freely say that yes, patriarchy, it affects women worse than it affects men. But here, I'll have to add some caveats, right? Now, some questions that arise here are women and men impacted by climate change in the same way? That's the most obvious question that we start with. Are gender hierarchies, and we already know that there are gender hierarchies, are they part of the social causes of climate change? And that's another point that I'd like you to think about, that of course you have to look at climate change as a science, but you must look at it from a sociological as well as political and historical perspective too. And that's when the right questions will start coming to you. Is climate governance gendered? We've already looked at the third question, which is climate governance being gendered. Whatever I said before, this was essentially about climate governance. So let's see what else I can add. Now, the broad answer to all these three questions, of course, is yes, gender and its associated power relations are indeed a very integral feature of climate impacts, adaptation, and mitigation. Now, the feature, however, as I mentioned, does not necessarily operate in any predefined manner. And how do we know this? From a lot of the empirical evidence that is coming in, mostly from case studies that have been carried out world over. Now, I'll just flag some of these, and I hope these become future directions of things. So one of the ways to think about women and climate change is in terms of vulnerability, and this is what comes to mind. Women are vulnerable to climate change. Women are victims of climate change, and this is something that becomes the dominant discourse. And partly we know this is true because the link between gender, poverty, and climate change, last 30, 40 years, we've been looking at evidence of this. So there are very clear connections between impacts of climate change and gendered vulnerabilities. That is the idea that women get impacted very differently as compared to men, perhaps more than as compared to men, right? But to say that this has something to do with the inherent weakness of women, that is problematic. This is not the case, because women are inherently or intrinsically have some kind of natural character which makes them more vulnerable. And this is also not borne out by the empirical research that have happened. So then why do women become more vulnerable if it doesn't come from within? That's because of the normative structure within which we operate, the things that are expected or not expected of us from women, which make us more vulnerable when events like climate-related events take place, right? And of course, men's superior social status within patriarchy. Now, of course, in the developing countries, women are impacted by climate change, often due to resource scarcity, which has been induced by climate. So what that does is that women's labor, their time, their income, everything gets affected. And you must read this seminal piece written by Professor Beena Agarwal. A lot of the research that I often read comes from the West, and they talk about all of these things. And very often they do not acknowledge the fact that it was an Indian scholar, Professor Beena Agarwal. She was the one, who wrote the seminal text, and she did empirical work. She's an economist. She's a brilliant lady who worked out exactly what are the ways in which environmental issues and climate issues impact women. And so whatever I'm saying now, that resource scarcity leads to increase in time, effort, labor, increase in vulnerability to violence, so on and so forth. So, one of the examples I can give you is that mostly in rural areas in India, it is the task of women to go and bring home water for drinking, right? So now if there's a pond closer to your house and because of climate change, it dries up, now the women have to walk further away. So that's taking a lot more of their energy. It's taking a lot more of their time. So earlier where they would go 5 kilometers, now they're going 10 kilometers. Now this takes time. So what happens typically is when the women come back, there are other members of their household, perhaps their husbands, brothers, fathers, sitting and asking, where were you all this time? Because as you know, women also do not have control over how they use their time outside of the house, right? And this has often led to violence. And what this does is that if they are, for instance, involved in some small household work, for example, collecting honey or something, which they can sell in the local market and supplement the household income. They don't have any time for that, because what they're doing is they're going really far to fetch water, which is absolutely non-negotiable. So this is an example to show you how resource scarcity impacts women. But we must remember that it's not just gender. Intersectionality must come into the picture when we are looking at questions of climate change. So class, age, education, life cycle stage, household headship, all of these are things that kick into the picture. When you put it together with the variable of gender, that's how you're going to get some kind of a response. Now, where are some standard drawbacks? Irrigation, land, credit support, these enhance gender inequalities, right? So very often irrigation goes to larger lands, where typically which are owned by men, not by women. In fact, most of the times women don't own land, and women also, if they do own land, they don't get credit support, they don't get loans. So all of these problems that are created as a result of climate change get exacerbated. And so there is less scope to participate in disaster management activities. Also, women are sort of kept out of those, and they could bring in great knowledge, great ideas, but again, this also intersects with caste, laws, customs, problems and barriers in accessing information, communication. In a lot of rural areas, you may or may not be surprised, but the use of mobile phones by women is looked down upon. So mobile phones, which could be easily used as a wonderful method of communication and gathering information, is often looked at with suspicion. Right? So a lot of women are not given mobile phones, or they are continuously asked, what are you doing at this point of time, cutting off a massive source of communication. Then they don't have land titles, so they cannot help with any adaptation projects. If you don't have land, how can any adaptation project which involves land usage, women will not be able to participate. Then in terms of history, you have to look at the history of power via colonialism, capitalist development in whichever part of the world you're in. And this, of course, definitely impacts the global south a lot more, because we were the areas that were colonized. Now, are there any problems with this focus on vulnerability? The only thing which you have to be careful about is that if you look at women as only being vulnerable victims, then it reinforces the idea of weakness of women, which is already a stereotype which is operating in our environment. And what it also does, therefore, is say that, okay, we've already assigned fixed roles to women. We've told them stay in the house, do this, do that. Why do they need to step out and start getting involved in, climate related policies, projects, so on? So again, they are pushed back because they are seen as defenseless. And therefore, we need to move beyond this narrative of vulnerability. We accept the narrative and then we move beyond it, right? We'll also find that some issues are not gendered at all. So there was a case in Mexico where these GM crops were being grown, and researchers meant to see whether men and women have different opinions on GM crops, because GM foods are generally very controversial, right? So they asked a bunch of people, both men and women, and they found that there was literally no difference. So even as feminists, even as people who are working on questions of gender, we still need to understand that always the answer will not be what we are looking for. And we must remain open to those ideas and then operate within these constraints, right? I've already mentioned that environmental stress leads families to diversify income, and this has some very funny impacts. It can have two types of impacts. So of course, traditionally, if you're doing agriculture, because of sea level rise or salinity, you lose access to land. What you do, you'll start going into other fields. Now, suppose a woman starts earning, which empowers her. This can either lead to enhanced abuse and control. Alternatively, it can lead to her further empowerment, but it empowers her, she will still face abuse and challenges. You see how this vicious circle sort of works, right? It can then cause additional stress. But of course, there is the chance of greater economic autonomy that comes to women when there's diversification of sources of income. Now, here comes a very troubling question, the question of masculinities, because so far we've looked at women, we haven't seen masculinities are involved, because that's also an aspect of gender. Now, in Australia, what happened was that climate change led to greater impact on men in terms of the total workload, because a lot of the land related work that was being done by men. So when climate change started involving, impacting the forest, the water, the land, the workload on men actually went up. And because the workload went up, the socialization went down, the social isolation went up, and that led to physical and mental illnesses increasing in men. It's a very complex sort of link, right? But it is a link which has now been empirically sort of drawn out. So we really need to pay attention also to the question of masculinity. And this, physical illness and mental illness actually led to a crisis of identity and a crisis of masculinity. Why? Because men are always supposed to be strong. So if men are suddenly falling ill, they are not able to handle themselves either physically or mentally, it puts a question mark on their entire identity. But it wasn't just this. I found another piece of research which was done in Nicaragua, where there was an adaptation program on cattle ranchers. Now, cattle ranchers, if you've seen these Western movies coming out of Hollywood, very, very patriarchal movies, right? You'll have a man on a horse, pushing cattle around, but also going into the bar or what is called the saloon in the evening and getting into brawls and fist fights. And those fist fights are always resolved with the use of a gun or with like a, fisticuff or a fight. The entire scene is extremely patriarchal. So cattle ranching is something that very few women are involved in. So I was reading this research, I found it fascinating. So what happened was that an adaptation program by an NGO was put in place saying that cattle ranching is not good. Why is that? Because in order to create pastures for the cattle, you are clearing out forests, which is leading to greenhouse gas emissions. So now, in the off season, instead of clearing out forests, what you do is you plant cocoa. Cocoa is the seed from which chocolate is made, and in South America, this is a major crop, right? And they forced the people to do that. And you see, the rich farmers got away with it because they simply hired, more hands and said, "Aap kar lo." So it did not impact their social status. It did not impact their masculinity. But with the small and the medium farmers, what happened, who were doing all the work on their own, they were very unwilling to become part of these adaptation programs. And of all the reasons, because it impacted their social status, which impacted their own sense of masculinity. Now, you see, if an adaptation program is attacking a man's sense of masculinity and then he doesn't want to participate in it, then your plan has essentially failed. You've not been able to, take their sensitivities, sensibilities into account and factor that. You just said, oh, these men are destroying the forest, so let's force them for 3 months in a year to grow cocoa. Right? So these are deeply problematic aspects, and that's why I said gender and not just women, though most of my presentation will be about women because, of course, women are the excluded category. But as someone who also dabbles a little bit in understanding masculinities in the right sort of way, we're not talking toxic masculinity here. We're actually understanding what the universe of men is like so that we can fashion better policies. They have better impacts, so on and so forth, right? Then we also need to look at parts of overconsumption. This is a research which is relatively new. Do men overconsume more than women? Now, this can actually be disaggregated because the public space is so much more male dominated. In the initial, few research that has come in, apparently men do overconsume more than women and therefore are more responsible for GHG gas emissions. So, one would think that, penalize men more than the women. But the counter argument to this is that if you then make this a man-woman issue, it will be very difficult to talk people into taking action which will reduce greenhouse gas emission. The other thing which comes to my mind will immediately happen is that there will be greater pushback against women's participation in, a lot of these negotiations, because then men and women will see each other as the enemies, right? This is one problem. The other side of this is, those scholars who believe that this is not problematic, is that this kind of disaggregation actually helps us get empirical evidence on, where overconsumption is coming from and therefore address it accordingly. So this is a bit of a, an area where feminists are not quite resolved in terms of, how to approach this. Should we disaggregate GHG emissions by gender. And this is just a question that I'm going to leave you with. Then we've already spoken about underrepresentation in climate governance. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm going to go into one final aspect, which I think is very, very important: the knowledge systems within which all these negotiations and dialogues are taking place, right? So for the longest time, the monopoly on producing knowledge has been of men. If you went to the older universities and colleges, there were no women over there, neither teaching nor learning. Opening up spaces of education to women is again relatively very, very recent. So before women came in, right, the formal production of knowledge system was all in the hands of men. And so, when enlightenment happens in Europe, or even scientific advancement or mathematical advancement, knowledge advancement happens in other parts of the world, typically the stories that you'll hear in history is that men did it, right? Now it is on this system of science that you are basing your negotiations on. So that means, to begin with only, you have not taken into account women's knowledge, right? And to start with, you have excluded it, knowledge systems of women, thereby making the entire exercise very, very patriarchal. Now, why do we say this? That's because women are traditionally the carriers of what is called traditional or indigenous knowledge, even though they were not allowed to come into the formal systems of education. So that doesn't make women brainless. Within the environment they were living in, they were continuously observing and picking up information. In fact, a lot of the doctors, midwives, these were, of course, women. A lot of the women, in a book that I read and a couple of articles that I read, that, women who were called witches were essentially women who knew about human anatomy, and that made men of the time extremely insecure. So they were branded witches and thrown out of society so that they couldn't use their expertise. And that advanced knowledge was often called witchcraft. Why? Because it was so advanced that others hadn't heard of it till such time. So they see something unfamiliar and say, "Oh my God, she must have done some magic," right? Burn her at the stake. So this is an argument. If you read the literature or the history of witchcraft, you will find this argument being put forward quite forcefully and with evidence, with the appropriate evidence, right? So women are also carriers of indigenous knowledge. Now, if you look at the IPCC reports, etc., on which we base our entire discussion on climate change, if you open them, they're all full of data, numbers, etc., which if you haven't done advanced science, you can't fathom it. And who does advanced science mostly? STEM is dominated by men. Again, so knowledge systems on which we are basing this, that also excludes women. And I think this excessive technocratic focus on the dialogue, what again it does is excludes women, particularly indigenous women, who are carriers of local level ecological knowledge, which is then not permeating to the top at all. So I think with this very long lecture, I have given you lots to think about in terms of the connection between what is gender, why it's important, dialogue, why it's important politically, and then connecting it to gender and climate change. It's been about an hour, so I shall stop now. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm open to any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sengupta. Judging by the fact that everyone's reaction, I think a lot of people have actually enjoyed this session. It just brought a few things. One of the things that I have mentioned earlier in this course is about water wives in Maharashtra, where men marry, multiple women, because so I think that is
because so that they can go and fetch water, right?
Yes. So and I mean, when one gets pregnant, then you need a second one to kind of a younger one. Yeah,
go and do the work. Exactly.
Get the water. Yes. Then also, I think another thing that sort of came to mind was also this entire part about overconsumption. That in Bangladesh they did a study that in rural areas especially, there's this culture in South Asia that men eat first, then the kids, and then the women.
Yes.
So the malnutrition obviously happens from that part. So obviously resources are going to get worse and worse scarce, then automatically it'll it'll affect a woman more. That is also
Women's health is very badly, in
yes.
fact, impacted by all of these. And as resource scarcity increases, these cultural norms will make it worse for women.
Yes, yes, and I think another thing that one of the students was very interested in is interested in Asna. She's I think her having internet issues is migration. So if
Yeah.
you could just maybe touch upon a little bit about how climate migration is going to be worse. For again, obviously intersectionality, but like any refugee crisis, I
So
think.
I'll give you a very small example, something which she can think of if she's hearing, or you can convey this to her. So in one of the articles I read again, it was, I think, based on the continuous flooding in Bangladesh. So the floods in Bangladesh also have been put into different categories, and not all floods are undesirable or climate induced. But something that I read, which I found very fascinating, that women are not taught to swim. Why? Because what will you do swimming? No, I can see Tulika smiling. Now, you see, if you're living in a delta area, like what is broadly the region of, West Bengal and East Bengal, or Bangladesh, sorry, um, you need to, swimming is a survival skill. There's so much water over there, but you don't teach women how to swim. So when the floods come, who gets to jump and save their lives? Not the women. And who get to therefore migrate? The men get to migrate relatively easy than the women. That option of migration for women is not there. Another thing is that the dangers in the process of migration for women is far more, and this is true of war as well. Climate change, sexual assault on women through the process of moving from one part to another, because we are not talking here of the kind of migration that the elite do, which is fairly comfortable. We are talking about sort of migration that poor people who are climate refugees are doing. In fact, one of my PhD students, he's working on precisely this topic. And I'm waiting to read his chapter. He's done some field work. I'm waiting to read his chapter, and I'll catch him if he doesn't have a gendered analysis. But this to me comes in mind already. Migration, climate refugees is already a category right now, right? You have climate refugees in various parts of the world. And so if you see climate change as what has been called a threat multiplier, it multiplies the vulnerability of women. But having said this, because women are also very enterprising, women also have agency, which is not something that we should forget ever. It could also lead women to come up with new and innovative adaptation ideas. Now, here for me, what bothers me is typically, a lot of these adaptation plans are made at the top, right? Not at the grassroots, not in a decentralized way. So when you typically impose something which has been made in these, fancy buildings and fancy spaces, tell women to do that, that may backfire. It may not work. It may not be, it's not as if you do it with malice, but it may not just work. So how about involving women at the implementation will always involve women at the local areas. But in the process of migration, women will always again be, disadvantaged for two reasons. One, the lack of skills, because of the social norms, because of which they've not been imparted certain skills. Second, the process of migration itself is very painful, and this is not to say that men cannot face sexual assault. Men face sexual assault also from men, by the way, majority, right? But with women, it's practically a given. So when you have climate refugees, the chances of this kind of abuse and violence will also increase for them. Now you have to include women in the big dialogue processes in order for these concerns to be brought out, and so dialogue becomes important.
Yeah. This just mind. I mean, I did not think of the swimming skill at all. It just didn't cross my mind.
I also didn't think of it. I read it in a paper when I, normally read on climate change. I read it and my God, I never thought of this.
And this a similar thing, not similar, but of course different thing happened when the floods in in Sindh in Pakistan.
Huh.
So there was this one girl who runs an NGO, and I'm in touch with her, and she mentioned that when the government was sort of distributing essentials, they completely forgot, the menstrual hygiene products. They just completely forgot, because the men are the people who are deciding, making all the. So they
Amen.
got together, and like you said,
Exactly.
they have agency. So the women got together and they started, you know,
I deliberately said it's 2024 and we are still invisible. I
yes,
mean, this shouldn't be a thing. I
yeah.
mean, menstrual hygiene products should be normal.
And she actually came and said that, why it's not like there are floods, so women will stop menstruating. It's not. It's just another,
Exactly.
like, hunger, and,
Exactly.
like, it's the same thing.
So you
Anyways,
see,
I
I teach, I teach both boys and girls, and I interact with a lot of young men. And I must say that compared to men of my generation, generally there I have seen an improvement in terms of not being cagey about talking about, menstrual health and all that. Now the younger generation is much better, but even so, it is not at the level where you'd want it, where men would be thinking as much about the needs of women and non-binary persons also, by the way, as much as they think about men and their requirements. It is still an unequal asymmetrical world, and
yes.
that's why for me, questions around gender are not obvious.
Mhm.
That's why we have to look at the obvious questions, because the answer may not be an obvious one.
Right, absolutely. So I think we can open the floor for questions. And you can just raise your hand, or you can just unmute, because we are a cozy group. So I think whoever wants to go first, we can, maybe. Tulika, would you like to? Huh? Okay,
Yes,
great.
ma'am. Good evening, ma'am.
Hi,
Suchitra,
Tulika.
ma'am. Hello.
Sucharita.
Sucharita, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
So I really liked the entire session. I'm not at all
Thank
critical
you.
about it. I don't really have any questions which would criticize to anything, whatever you said. And this is one of the sessions I feel in which we somehow got a very holistic, the entire view of what we were supposed to know by you, right? And when I like read the topic, then I was a little skeptical about it, little critical. But like, how would uh, this gender thing would determine in what is going on climate wise? But then I was like, okay, we have to do this. Let's just give it a try. So, but then, yeah, ma'am, I really liked the entire thing. Like, you involved everything, like dialogue itself. How you said that morality is subjective. There's no one objective morality, and how we are supposed to be neutral in taking decisions. And the most
That doesn't
important,
happen actually. Doesn't
yeah,
happen. That's so
yeah,
difficult.
right. And how efficiency of the entire negotiation would be really fine if we yeah, involve women. So there was this one point which kind of uh, it was very interesting for me, how you said that formal education was not provided to women and it
I
was
do
provided to
understand.
men like ancestral times. But then the knowledge that has been, the lineage of the knowledge has been followed. So it's a pretty like nice thing. We always get to hear all the nani and dadi ki kahaniyan. Nobody has ever said nana ji ki kahaniyan ya dada ji ki kahaniyan.
Not just that, it's very interesting. You've all heard the phrase "dadi maa ke nuskhe" ya "nani maa ke nuskhe."
Exactly.
Now you see, why is what Dadaji telling you knowledge and what Dadi telling you nuskhe?
Right.
It's the manner in which the language is used to codify knowledge, which can give higher value or decrease the value of what is. So if when you're thinking in gender terms, there's a lot of work that has been done on this, the gendering of knowledge. I think you seem very excited about it. You must pursue it and you must read more about it. It'll be so eye-opening, because none of us are born knowing these things. We grow up, study, learn, listen to someone, and then we figure these things out. It's
Exactly,
true.
ma'am. The
In
point.
tribal societies, also a lot of it's the women who know a lot of things like kaun si jadi booti khane se kaun si bimari ka hal ho jayega. These are things that a lot of women know, but this is not seen as serious medical input. I'm not saying, I'm not suggesting that you go all unscientific as far as medicine is concerned, but then we need to ask the question that what is science? If something that is working and it's a kind of knowledge that is held by women, why would you not call it science? Why does a midwife and midwifery has been one of the oldest professions in the world, right? Who brings in a child into the world, given such a low status, but an OBGYN, obstetrician gynecologist, has a completely different status. So this tells us also about the gendered understanding of science, which then cuts across traditional knowledge. I must also clarify here that not all traditional knowledge is useful, but also not all traditional knowledge is useless. At least we need to dive into that world to see what we can, conserve and keep from there and will be useful for us.
Thank you. Naim, you're next on my screen. Would you like to go?
Thank you, madam, for the session. As this video is going to be published in social media, it would be better to make it on talk. Maybe it can be a problem for me in Afghanistan. But I hope that one day we would consider the gender.
Thank you.
Okay. Sonal, you're next on my screen. Please go ahead.
Good evening, Sucharita ma'am.
Hi,
That was one amazing session we have ever had. And honestly, you have put together all the things so beautifully, and it was just amazing. One thing on the gender, I would like to just comment on or say something about it, because even I took a session on gender equality some days before, and mostly people talk about feminism and how women are oppressed and everything. And at the same time, I want to bring in the picture about like how some men are also oppressed. And when we see, like in terms of their social status, ego, and many factors are there. But one main factor is the mental health as well. The stress level they go through, and just to be the provider of the family and all stuff. We must have seen these, for example, the heart attack rates. In men, it is more than in women.
I'm so sorry, Sonal, but I've been working with a psychiatrist, and the heart attack rates of women are more than those of men, which is not to deny your point. Yes, women, and it's like a hidden epidemic, and that's the other problem. It doesn't get recorded as much, but women are very, very highly prone to heart attacks. And this is like an MBBS doctor who's, one of the top psychiatrists in India doing that, who told me this. So I guess I'm going to have to believe him. But I mean, I understand your point. I mean, I understand the broader point. You're saying, please continue.
Yeah. So might be there must be a study going on, and it has not known to many people. But according to my knowledge, that yes, that it has been a situation where suppose a small boy, he's always said that you have to be strong, you cannot cry, you cannot do this and all stuff. And
thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and that and what is happening in that process, that like he's suppressing his emotions, and because of that, all the problems get started, the health issues get started,
completely agree with you. So this is Sonal, this is something called socialization. When I take now I don't, but for the last 10 years I've been teaching a paper on gender to my BA classes, and this question not only comes up, but it's very fascinating for me that nowadays, the young girls, they are very open. They want to talk about what's going on with them, but the boys just keep quiet. And then, I start telling them things. I start poking them and needling them, and I start asking them that, you probably wanted to take up arts, but someone in your family said, arts to ladkiyon ke liye hota hai. And, you pushed and got away, and you pushed it aside, and you're unhappy, and you're depressed clinically very often. And then, other examples, like, maybe they may not want to fight, but they're forced to fight to prove, that they're boys, etc. And you'll not believe it, Sonal, whenever I talk about, and this is what is studied under masculinities, right? And when I speak to them, I get this amazing response. The first day, they're all quiet. By the second, third day, 1, 2, slowly they start speaking up. And so, hence gender, so that we can include all genders. And unfortunately, within the scope of my paper, I cannot discuss too deeply about LGBTQIA communities, but we have to consider that spectrum as well.
Of course.
But Sonal, one thing which, I only one point that I'd like to mention, and your point is not only very well taken, but I think, men's mental health issues then translate into societal and political problems. And so we must keep that in mind, right? It's not that they're strong and have solutions all the time. But, systemically, if you're talking about the system, the structure, that is essentially patriarchal. Even the boys who are suffering mental health issues are essentially operating within a patriarchal structure where they also have to conform to the patriarchy. And that's why, when I gave this lecture, I gave 2 examples, one from Australia and one from Nicaragua. So one a rich country and one a poor country, about what happens to men and their masculinity and the kind of pressures they face when, these climate discourses come in. And I think even if I am looking at gender, these are complications that we must acknowledge and we must record them empirically in order to have a clear and better view. So your point is very, very well taken.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sonal, for the comment. Munir, would you like to go next?
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am, for this lecture. I have been hearing about you much in Jamia, so I didn't get...
Really? Are you from Jamia?
Yeah, I'm from Jamia only. So thank you for this. I was always, looking for such a session and all. So since
I'm sorry, which center are you from in Jamia?
I am from Center for Comparative Religions and Civilizations.
Oh, so Manisha is teaching there, huh?
Manisha has left there. So
Manisha Sethi, she's left?
She has gone to Hyderabad now, Hyderabad University.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So since I belong to this religious studies thing, my question would be more oriented towards that. So talking of climate change, we have seen that there have been many courses going on from UGC, from other interfaith organizations, and from many, UN going on and talking about religion and climate change, or religion and gender.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. But what I fail to see is everywhere that predominantly religion has not much to do with gender in terms of appreciating them, or in terms of evolving notion of theirs, as much as it's to with masculinity. So they don't consider them in the process of any revolution, any change, which you correctly mentioned that they were not in formal education, they were not in policy making, they still are very, very less. So when we see that religions still go to their scriptures for these suggestions and for advising, we do not see women there, or we do not see LGBTQI community there. So how do we tackle this issue and get religion talk about climate change when gender is nowhere there existing?
Okay, Munir, that's a really difficult question you posed to me, because quite unlike you, I'm actually not an expert on religion. And so I'm not very sure about whether I can give you a definitive answer on this. But having said that, I had never really thought about religion's engagement with climate change till I actually read this piece by Professor Romila Thapar. She years ago, Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan, he had brought out this volume which was targeted at young scholars, so at the BA and MA level. And in that, one of the earliest readings is this reading from, which is an extract from one of her books called Gram and Aranya, right? So that's, village and forest, forests and settlements, however you'd like to call it. And in that, what she does is that she makes references to a variety of religions where integrating nature into religion, either via rituals, etc., simply in order to give the importance to nature and to ecology, that she highlighted. So she gave a number of examples. For example, and this she did not write, but this was something I had read somewhere, and unfortunately, I'm totally forgetting the source of where I read. The significance of green in Islam, for example. Now, one of the things which I read, which I maybe you could correct me on this if I'm wrong, was that you see, Islam came up in Saudi Arabia, which is a desert area, and so when you find an oasis in a desert, where there's some greenery, so that green, of course, becomes like a source of life, and it's also something that signifies nature, right? I found this, maybe because I work on environment, I found this argument very compelling, and I found it very exciting, right? But other than this, also there are other Islamic texts, which talk about, respect of animals and birds. So non-human nature, which is also part of environmental discourses. And you find the same in Buddhism, you find the same in the Vedic religions, so on and so forth. So she has given some of these arguments where essentially what she does is she recovers religion's old respect for nature, and sort of one can use that to convince people that look, our religions have always told us to have respect for nature, so on and so forth, because that is something ordinary people will listen to. You go and tell ordinary people that our average ppm now is 450 ppm. No, but nobody cares. Who cares? You look at the pollution in Delhi every day. Who is caring, right? But you go and tell them that religious texts argue that we should take care, though that might, and I'm only saying might because we also have the Ganga, most precious for a lot of us, and yet so dirty and so destroyed, right, in certain parts. But there's no harm in looking at this as an option. In fact, some eco-feminists, they and only a small part, not all eco-feminists, but a small part of eco-feminists are practically use this connection between spirituality coming either from religion, but also not necessarily coming from religion, simply coming from some other source, and linking it to questions of environment in a bid to resolve environmental problems. And there is also this argument that women are more caring, women are closer to nature, so on and so forth, and so women can take care of nature better. So there is that problem with that argument for a whole lot of women like us, and the women whose works I have read and grown up, would be that then you're putting the entire burden of taking care of nature on women by saying that there's a special connection. Right. So now, apart from all the other things that women do, they have to do this. So I'm not very sure whether, the reason I will not give you a definitive answer is simply because I have not researched enough on this. But I've just pointed out some things to you, which perhaps you as a student of religion could, take it forward and explore. And maybe, you can come and meet me in my department in Jamia and let me know what you understood. I hope that was a satisfactory response given my limitations in this area.
Yes, ma'am, that is it. Yeah, I would love to meet you there soon.
Great.
We will discuss about it. Yeah. So I'll let others to ask anything if they have to. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Munir. We actually I do know people who have been doing this, in Delhi. So I will put you in touch with. We have this United Religions Initiative, which I think Bezan is also part of. Is also a partner. In Dialogue is also a partner of, and I'm also a member of, and I'll put you in touch with them. So we actually in 2019 we had a conference where we got people from a lot of from different religions, like different religious leaders, to talk about environment and climate change. So, yeah. Okay, so we move on. Poonam, would you like to go next?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Poonam.
Hello, ma'am. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm Poonam. I'm doing PhD in economics, and my research area is also gender issue in labor, basically paid,
Oh,
unpaid work. Yeah. So
wonderful.
when you were asking that why we should include women in the climate change issue, so I was just pondering over that. Then I thought Uh, climate change is impacting everyone, like men, women, all. So like and but it is not affecting same way. It is affecting differently to different people. So maybe including everyone, bringing all perspective how it is impacting, so that it could become collective, collective
Action?
collective action. So that's why it is important, because when I see that I come from also a remote village, and like lots of responsibilities are carried by women, like especially like the role of women in our society is like they are nurturer, and
Yes.
men have different role, like they are provider, they are protector. So coming together and working for this issue is important. And it also, like you stated in your session, like how it is impacted men in Australia, like it increases their burden of work. So it is also increasing women's burden of work, because like fetching water from a well is a women's job, mostly in rural area, in especially in today's context. Like when we go in tribal communities, and even in the small villages, there these practices are still in
Yes.
existence. And
Yes.
when the water level is going down, the work burden is increasing. And also health issue also, coming up with the climate change, like. And also women are the caregiver in our home. So
Exactly.
if people have cough and everything, it's also increasing the burden of women, burden of work on women. So yeah, it is impacting. Yeah, and thank you
Actually, I
so
think
much.
I should give you time to talk because, one of my very big handicaps is that for the last 4, 5 generations, my family's been very urbanized. And, well, the village that we belong to is now in a separate country called Bangladesh. For me, even though I've done some rural internships, my understanding is probably very poor. So perhaps I should let you speak and tell me exactly what happened, so that I think all of us learn from that. So thank you so much, saying all these things, because it gives me confidence that what I'm saying is not nonsense. You're sort of validating a lot of what I said.
Oh, thank you, ma'am.
All the best
Yeah,
with your PhD.
thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Poonam is also doing PhD from your alma mater, so from JNU.
Which is,
So
so I'm from JNU
Yes,
too. Come on.
yes, ma'am. Yes.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I saw the buildings at the back and I was wondering whether I should ask you, are you on JNU campus?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. This is UGC office. Like the MHRD branch is in here in JNU, so that office.
Yeah, yeah.
Sitting in the garden of that building.
That's such a lovely way to study, no?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, I usually study in library. So for speaking and having discussion, I had to come here.
Nice.
So I think again what Poonam said, one of the things that she mentioned is the increased load on women because they are caregivers. Even if men or kids or anybody else falls ill, I think that is the fact that we've not thought of this. Like and I consider myself a feminist. I consider myself somebody who notices these things more. So I think the fact that somebody who looks at these things, you know, a little more. A little more with women in mind has not thought of this is again something that how clueless we
That's
are.
okay. No, Pragya, it's all right. None of us are born knowing everything. That's one of the things instead of shaming people for not knowing things, we basically need to encourage them to know. So there is especially in feminist labor economics and all of that. there's a lot of work on caregiving, and a lot of it has actually been quantified also. So you have both qualitative and quantitative work, and if there's something you're interested in, you must go for it and learn it. But even just look at our own lives. Ever since we are children, I mean, I'm sorry to the men sitting over here, but it's a common experience for women to be brought up from a very young age to care for others. Now, there's one question I always ask in my BA classes. I ask all the boys, tell me, are you not caring people? So they all turn around and say, ma'am, of course we are caring people. So then I said, okay, then why not take on some of that burden of actual pragmatic care? And yet you see women are constantly groomed, brought up, इनका ये ख्याल रखो, उनका वो ख्याल रखो, and it becomes in some contexts where this is very new. If I ever say that when you're told that mummy does everything for you because she loves you, and I'm going to problematize that argument, mummy doesn't do everything necessarily out of love, but because she's been socialized and she's been put in a certain gender role that she is the primary caregiver of the household. It gets very interesting reactions. So you must follow this line of thought, Pragya. Like, I think the whole point of these discussions is to just learn from each other.
There was this entire study where they counted in different countries how much unpaid work women are doing, and there was this entire thing that in Canada it's half an hour more than the men, and in like South Asia, at least in India, it is 5.5 hours every day more. And then I calculated it, and over the year it comes out that the woman gives a woman of the house gives the man about 4.5 months of vacation, free vacation, because she's taking on,
Wow, how did you do this? Amazing. This is brilliant.
Calculate 5.5 hours over the number.
You multiply it.
Total number of hours over the year, and then you divide it by 8 hours, which is a working week, a working day. One man.
And hence this very problematic idea कि housewife हैं कुछ नहीं करती. When someone is in a job and being introduced, they're introduced with their designation when they're women. But if they're a homemaker, very often, no, she doesn't do anything. She's a housewife. Oh my Lord. Do you have any idea how much work housewives do? Our entire system would collapse if housewives did not do the kind of work that they did. And yet, while thinking about them, we don't think of what they do as labor at all. So I think that's something which in the classroom or in certificate courses like this, we draw attention, deliberate attention to those areas and force ourselves to think about it, reflect on it.
Yes.
It's so great you brought that up.
So Zikra, you're next.
Good evening, ma'am. Hi,
Hello,
good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much. The whole session was so interactive, so interesting, so interesting, ma'am. It was like you just speak and I listen. It was like that. I don't have any particular question about the session, but yes, I would like to say what you said in the last, that housewife, housemakers. People used to say they are nothing, they are not doing anything, they are just housemaker. You are right, ma'am. We are housemaker. I'm also a housemaker right now. I'm looking for an opportunity. So it's not like we are a housemaker and we are not doing. We are doing 24 hours job.
Yes.
We are getting up in the night and we are taking care of the kids. We are getting up in the morning, we are sending them schools, we are taking them back. We are doing 24 hours job. You are right. So the whole session was so interesting, was so good, marvelous, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Oh, wow, you guys are making my day.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zikra. This is going to be very precious for me, huh?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if Asna, if you're okay, you can. Yes,
Asna. Yes, good evening.
Good evening, ma'am. I am really sorry that I'm not able to switch on my camera due to the range issues.
No
But
problem.
thank you so much for the wonderful session. And I had a paper on gender studies last semester, and it is a paper that I really wanted to take. And I learned it, and I had given my exam last sem. So, whatever that you have discussed throughout this session, every topic I had come across because in my class, about language and gender, about socialization processes, about work and gender, and every different thing. But throughout studying gender, one thing that have always caught me is the concept of intersectionality. So, how far do you think that intersectionality or is talked about in feminism? Because as I studied, being a woman, you are already oppressed, and being a Dalit woman or coming from a lower class or
Or a
caste,
black woman or a
yeah,
minority
black woman,
religion. Yeah,
you
yeah.
face a double burden. That is what we
Yes,
call double
yes,
burden. So
yes.
how much do you think the feminism, mainstream feminism, talks about this intersectionality and addresses the issues of women coming from the lower class and caste of society? So I still
So,
remember
Asna,
studying
yeah,
about
sorry.
the
Yeah,
first wave of feminism. It was
yeah.
called as a white feminism. It was led
Yes,
by
yes,
predominantly by the white women, not
yes,
addressing the issues of black women who were
yes.
the working class also. So in the second wave, they told for them getting a job was liberation from the oppression. But
Mm.
again, a majority of black women were engaged in work at that time.
Yeah,
So
exactly. For them, work is not,
yeah,
liberation.
addressed, their work is not addressed, their issues are not bought in. So what is your view on intersectionality, and how often do you think feminism addresses this intersectionality of women?
Okay, so Asna, there was a point of time, as you quite rightly pointed out, that we had what was feminism was essentially, white elite feminism, and ever since Kimberly Crenshaw talked about intersectionality, I don't think at today's date, any feminist who's worth her salt will ever talk about feminism unless it is intersectional feminism. I think that's non-negotiable. Now, the willingness of different feminists to take this on may be different. The sort of sensibilities that you and me have, given in the kind of maybe education, university, or just our own personal sensibilities. I think, we will always think about intersectionality in our feminism, but it is also true that there are still feminists in the world, who believe they are mainstream, who don't think through these things. But I also sense that they are slowly no longer mainstream. I think intersectionality is now what is mainstream as it should be. It is intersectionality that should be mainstream, right? So I think, if you want to be a genuine and a committed feminist, you can't not look at these other identities that intersect with questions of gender. So that
Very
would be
true.
my answer.
Thank you so much for that. I have one more question.
Yes, please.
The question is, while studying gender, again, the concept that I've come through is gendered socialization. So, what
Yes.
I have learned and what I have observed throughout my small life is that women, in a way, are the major proponents of patriarchy because they have gone through this gendered socialization.
Okay.
We always reassert these gender roles, identities,
Mm.
responsibilities, the norms, the behavior patterns, the style,
Mm.
how a girl should be, how a woman should be. So they
So
are
these
very much
get
assertive.
reproduced across societies and
Yeah,
generations,
yeah, very
by
true.
women.
Yes, the reproduction of this again gendered norms is through women, majority through women. So what is your view on that?
Yeah, but that is not women's fault, is what I'd say. That's the structure of the personal. I mean, I was talking to Sonal. I was talking about the broad structure of patriarchy, right?
Yes.
What the structure of patriarchy does is that it forces all of us to operate by the standards of patriarchy. Please
Yes,
remember
yes.
that women who do not all women are, vocal and empowered like all of us sitting over here. I think all of us sitting over here can fight our fights. I think even the men sitting over here are the sort of men who would not be ashamed of, calling themselves feminists or, batting for gender equality. But please do remember that for a lot of women, there's a price to pay.
Yes,
There's
ma'am.
a price to pay for not conforming to these norms of society. Remember that they are not financially independent. Remember that they live in societies which would do anything from hurting them to sexually assaulting them to murdering them simply for breaking the norms, right?
Yes, ma'am.
To tell me, what choice do they have? And in this context, I think of my own mother, and I think of all the mothers of my friends, all my aunt figures who've lived a very different life from me. And they reproduce the norms that they were brought up into. And of course, when I was growing up, I resented it very much. The world has changed. Why are you forcing me to be this way? Why are you forcing me to be that way? It was only when I grew much older that I realized that they were socialized in so deeply. The
Yes.
fear of consequences was put in their minds so deeply because of the patriarchy that they dare not bring up their daughters any differently. And then the daughters, of course, rebelled because the world had also changed. Right?
Yes.
So the thing
Yes,
is that while it is true that women can be agents of patriarchy, I'm not sure that all women are willing agents of patriarchy. There are women who are, even when women seem to be willing agents of patriarchy, I think where they really assert themselves and say that they perpetuate essentially very authoritarian and very patriarchal sort of norms. They are fearing consequences. If you dig a little deep, I don't know whether any of you have studied psychology or not, but please go down that road and you will find that sometimes that fake bravado, I've got everything under control, I'm not a feminist, is also a manifestation of insecurity, which can stem from what will happen if I become too independent. I will pay a price in this world. So I think that's what I have seen. It would be very tempting for me to, it's very tempting to say, what kind of women are these perpetuating patriarchy? But that doesn't solve my problem, no.
Yes,
As someone whose job is to think deeper about these issues and also with a modicum of empathy. I'm not always empathetic, but I do think it's something we need to actively practice.
yes, ma'am.
And if you think about it, you will see those women also in some way uh, ending up making choices where they have never been given a choice.
Yes.
They don't have options, so they're just rolling with what's coming, right? And so yes, women are definitely can be agents of patriarchy, and that's why patriarchy is a system, right? It's there
Yes,
in
ma'am.
everyone. It's there in
Yes.
all of us, and it takes a lifetime to understand and then slowly root it out of ourselves.
Yes, ma'am.
I
Thank you
hope
so
that.
much.
Thank you.
Yes, it did. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Sengupta. I think another thing that, like you talked about the system, it's a system which pits one woman against the other, I think. And then you do whatever you have to do to survive. So and then
So the world is so, Pragya, the world is so dangerous for women that we are still looking at survival.
Yeah, and the thing is that they don't I mean, again, what Asna said is that perpetuation of patriarchy, but most women who actually perpetuate so-called patriarchy, they call it tradition. They're scared to get out of that circle because their survival depends on the men, and so I think again that is something, like you said, we have to be empathetic. Not that we shouldn't change it or question it.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, uh,
When
if
we
we just understand this, maybe we'll be less vicious to those women. That's
yes
all. Because there
yes
was a time when I was so angry, I would be so angry at even traditional looking women, and it took me a lot of time to reflect on why they are the way they are. And now I'm more at peace that coming to a logical understanding that they have compulsions. And then you ask the next question, who imposed these compulsions? And your answer is very straightforward: patriarchy. They themselves.
yes yes and that's why I think when you actually, again, we talk about dialogue. So when you have a dialogue with these women who are actually coming and making you feel, shaming you for not being part of the tradition or the pitch or that that box, then I think when you step into that dialogue space with more empathy, then it ends up actually
being
they're
more
able to also see
productive.
it. Yes,
Yeah,
yes. The
then
dialogue is better.
you probably sit and listen and and that's always a thing with all of us super educated, super empowered women. We'd like to go and teach, and one of the things that I learned is shut up and listen. You never
Yes.
know what you might take away. Just keep quiet. And you don't always, the realization doesn't always land immediately. Sometimes you listen, you go back, you still carrying the same ideas. 2 months later something will happen which will trigger that memory, and then you'll realize what that individual is saying. And so the process of dialogue itself is not that I sat with you for a 2-hour session and enlightenment happened. It's again
Yeah.
a continuous process of thought where we put out ideas. And that's what I said. Sometimes we may not like who we speak to, but the reason to speak to them should be that you may learn something. You may even
Yes.
detect something dangerous over there. And it's important to detect dangerous things.
No, absolutely.
I mean, it's not enough to say, "Arey, I don't like your point of view, go away." So then I don't understand what's in your mind, or what are your compulsions. And even with, I think with both with women and also non-binary genders, this is something we need to really practice to do.
No, absolutely.
I
So I
completely
think
agree with your
everyone,
point.
is there anybody who still has any burning question? Because we have about 10 minutes. So if in case, otherwise we can obviously end the session. It was, so I think before we, I mean, end it, if you could maybe forward us some of the readings that you would like, I mean, any,
I'll send you a bunch of readings.
yes.
Don't get mad at me for doing that, because I've been preparing for this lecture for a very long time and I downloaded a lot of things. So I'll share it all with you.
No, absolutely. I think now it's not mandatory reading; it's just suggested reading. So I think whoever's interested, they can go ahead. I'm
Of course.
sure I will be reading a lot of it, and I know Alia
I'll
also
share. I'll be
interested
very
in it.
happy to share. I'll be more than happy to share. I'll send them to Behzad. I'm sure he can
Yes.
forward them to you. But thank you so much for being such a nice audience and asking me so many questions and teaching me quite a few things. For example, I'd never really thought about the question of religion, which Munir asked, and linking it to questions of climate and gender. Tulika, I'm so glad you're going out of this finally impressed. I feel like I've earned my 2 hours of work. Thanks to all of you. And thank you so much, Behzad. I'm sure he's around somewhere, so please say thank you to him.
Yes.
And all the best for the rest of the program.
Thank you, Dr. Sengupta.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.